Hi, welcome back to week 4, and this is element 34, which I neglected to say that the last element with itness was element 33, so I apologize for that. But element 34 is really a continuation of the with itness trait, and element 34 specifically is what do I typically do to apply consequences for lack of adherence to rules and procedures. We'll also be covering element 35 today, and 35 is where you're going to address how do I respond positively to an adherence to rules and procedures. But we are going to start with the consequence side, which I know may seem a little negative, but it's an appropriate follow up to with itness. So in element 33 with itness, I talked about the response hierarchy and moving from a nonverbal to verbal to demand to consequence intervention sequence, or moving through that sequence. And that is the structure that we're going to use for this element. So I'd like to review those briefly in case you didn't dwell on those too much by the end of element 33. And then I'd like to provide you with some specific examples from my classroom experience as well as what is suggested by the book. So if you're looking for some ideas, this is the video to watch, and perhaps you've seen some of these in your practicum experiences thus far, or you've considered trying them as you've been teaching lessons. So in terms of teacher evidence, initially, again, the review is the teacher provides nonverbal signals when student behavior isn't appropriate, such as, and I know I continue to look at the book, but I could tell so many stories about this. I don't want to get off track too much, so I'm going to try to stick to the script. But the first one would be eye contact. So again, making eye contact without using language is very effective for many students. Proximity control, that goes along with itness and making sure you circulate throughout all quadrants of the room. Tapping on a student's desk, I definitely have a tendency with younger students to put my hand, and again, I'm trying to keep my hands below, if you remember that particular element, to not be too distracting, but I have a tendency to put my hand down on the desk of a student who isn't behaving correctly, and I'll even slide my hand over into their textbook. I'll even, place my hand gently on their hand if their hand is tapping a pencil. Never say a word, never move a muscle, anything differently to other students in the room. They're not even going to notice unless they are just staring directly at my hand, stopping that student from tapping maybe. So you just keep right on talking. You also might shake your head no at a student while you're talking, which I absolutely, in the midst of a conversation where I'm explaining a concept to students, I've been able to look directly at students and just shake my head no while I continue talking. And then if they do the correct thing, then I just sort of nod as if, all right, now we're getting there. All of that, and you just keep on trucking with your instruction. So hopefully you're able to make it with just those nonverbal interventions. The next level that you might find yourself moving to with teacher evidence would be those verbal signals that we've talked about. So sometimes you actually do have to say stop, and sometimes that's all it takes. Stop. Because if you've already maneuvered yourself closer to a student, or you have your hand somewhere in the vicinity of what they're doing, and they are already aware that you are displeased with their disruptive behavior, then sometimes a stop without shouting across the room is effective. Or, Mary, please stop. And then you can move on. Unless they're seeking attention. And if they like the fact that you've just said in front of the whole class, Mary, please stop, and the whole class giggles, they might be seeking attention for negative behaviors because it's the only attention that they get. Some students are like that, and then you have to know when not to say, Mary, please stop. So some things have to be more private with certain students, again, depending on the function of their behavior, the why do they do it. Verbally, you might just remind students, and this goes back to Harry and Rosemary Wong, you might remind them that what the classroom procedure is. So I'm just going to stick with Mary for purposes of this video. So Mary, the procedure for sharpening your pencil is to wait until instruction has ceased. Please have a seat and then you may finish sharpening it afterward. Simple. Mary, the procedure for turning in your papers is to wait until prompted, and then you may stand up and do that. Thank you. Finish with thank you. Make it impersonal. The procedure is use their name. Very, very important things. And most of the time, even when you do have to interject with verbals, you can get it under control with that. So use their name. Make sure that you say thank you afterward, and make sure that it is as impersonal and procedure oriented as possible. So that does come from the first days of school, also another thing that they emphasize. Um, Moving on, you might use group contingency consequences, which sometimes can be tricky. You might have learned them in your more formal classroom management instruction where they talk about interdependent group contingencies, where maybe you have a marble jar and you put in marbles for good behavior and it's group based, classroom based, and then take out a marble for inappropriate behavior. My word of recommendation or caution for using things like that doesn't mean that they're bad. There's something good for everything as long as you can use it wisely. So you have to be careful not to begin taking out marbles for what you're labeling as poor classroom behavior when there's an individual student in your class who perhaps needs a separate behavior plan, who is the one who is causing most of those marbles to be removed. Because if you continue to do that and take out the marbles every time that student doesn't behave appropriately, then that student's then going to become the target for the students in the classroom to say, you're the reason we're not earning our rewards. So if you're looking to fill that marble jar and the group is looking for that, please don't place a student in a position where they're going to be bullied or really targeted for something that you neglected to provide a service to them in the form of a behavioral contract for. So again, those aren't bad. They're good, but you have to be aware of your usage of them. Next would be that you might involve the home when appropriate. So if you need to, you can always contract with a family member or with a parent and discuss positive and negative consequences that work in the home and in the school setting, and then maybe duplicate those across settings, because generalization of behavioral strategies is actually the most powerful tool that you can use to make sure that students are going to behave in a way that's appropriate and less disruptive for the rest of their lives. So that generalization that can occur is really powerful. You also can do what the book talks about as calling a direct cost consequence. And that's something where if a student maybe overcorrection you've heard of, if a student tears up a book, I had a big old book tearer upper in one of my classrooms, and he just shredded books whenever he got mad. So it was something where I integrated the parent and school consequence. And when the child tore up the book, then I made sure that he knew that the consequence was that he had to work at home to earn enough money to provide money to buy another book for the school setting. And so not only did he have to replace the book that he tore up, he had to provide an extra book. I should clarify that. And the parents agreed with that. And then I also worked to find a different behavior for him that displayed that would allow him to release his aggression, because he tore those books up when he was angry. So I had to find an alternate source for him to actually use a physical item to release that physical aggression appropriately. And that's my child. And I'm going to politely ask him to step out of the room, because I told you in prior videos that this might happen. So you can see Nate in his jammies, and I think that might get him to leave the room, because this means that 27 college students are going to see him wearing his jammies unless he leaves the room and closes the door behind him.
I just have a question.
He has 10 seconds to leave the room. Here's classroom management in motion. You ready?
I just
10,
have a question.
9,
I said I
8,
just have a question.
7, or loses
Mommy.
the iPad. 6,
Mommy,
5,
why did the TV
4,
internet go
3,
off? Why did
2,
TV's internet go off?
1. Thank you. Please keep the door closed. I'll come to you when I'm done. Bonus. He's still going to keep talking, but we're going to ignore him, because this is one thing you can do with students. When they display an inappropriate behavior, you can ignore them. Then you can try a verbal intervention. And then if that doesn't work, you place a demand. So I placed a demand, and then I provided a consequence in the midst of the demand. And then when he complied, I thanked him. He exited the room, and then I will work on that consequence later if he continues to disrupt. So I didn't pay him to do that, but how much better could it be? You can see all 4 levels all at once. So because this video is becoming longer than I would like for you to have to watch, I will say that I've moved through the teacher evidence, and the student evidence, I'll go ahead and increase my voice level again now that I think he has moved away and doesn't hear me talking about him. The student evidence, the students are going to display they're going to cease the inappropriate behavior when the teacher signals. Now, those are my own children you've seen, so it takes a little longer sometimes for them to cease the inappropriate behavior. But he did. They accept consequences, are part of the way class is conducted. I know the most powerful thing for that child is to remove an electronic, so I knew I had to go to that when he wasn't responding to my other least intrusive interventions. And then when asked, the student describes the teacher as, being a fair applier of rules, that there's consistency in the way the teacher applies consequences, and no favoritism is shown. I would have done the same thing to his sister if she would have come in. So, some additional examples from the book that I will quickly go through would be to use what's called the pregnant pause. So, the pregnant pause is simply when you stop everything after perhaps you've given a verbal intervention, or you come to stand by a student with a nonverbal and you just wait. And then hopefully the students are quiet, or they cease the behaviors, even if they say, What did I do? You don't respond, you move on, and then you walk away. So there are methods that work, and you just have to not take the bait when they still try to engage with you if you've tried to use a lower level intervention in the hierarchy. Timeout is always an option, but I don't believe in setting a standard timeout procedure across the board for a general classroom setting. I have some concerns because I've seen teachers who used a timeout in a general classroom setting with 25 kids, and their timeout was to have the students go stand at the back of the room with their nose to the wall. And I don't believe in that. I don't think it's effective. I think it's humiliating. I think it's demeaning. And I would go on record as saying that to anyone. So, but I will say that in a separate classroom setting where I had 10 to 12 students with emotional disabilities, I had a timeout setting. I had a very specific scenario. I had very specific steps. And in terms of intensity of a situation, I did use the timeout scenario for when I felt a student was becoming too escalated to control using my other least intrusive interventions, and I didn't want to always be removing students to the hallway or to the detention space, or having an administrator or security guard come and get them. So timeout was effective in that scenario. But again, that's a discussion that I think you need to have with an experienced individual when you have a specific classroom setting in which you think that that's going to be an appropriate outlet for you to use as a consequence. And never just put students in the hallway without supervision. Please don't do that. And if you see it happening, I'm not suggesting you go in and critically assess someone's choice to do that, but if possible, observe how that process works, and maybe reflect on that in your journal if that's something you observe, especially in terms of safety. I also would like to address in closing specifically that high intensity situation. And there comes the cat because it's that kind of a day. Everybody's going to disrupt. Again, I didn't pay her to disrupt either. But for a high intensity situation, I want you to follow some guidelines that I've mentioned before. And for those high intensity situations, I want you to first determine the degree of involvement that you might require from an outside administrator or security guard or the classroom teacher next door. Experience will provide that to you, but you do need to know that when a safety issue is potentially going to occur, or you're in the process of it, see, there's the cat, then you need to be able to identify that you're going to need help and how you're going to get it quickly. Secondarily, I mentioned before, I want you to stay calm, step back if you can, even if it's for only 5 to 10 seconds, step back, develop a plan of action in your head as you start to take a deep breath and try to calm that nervous stomach or that shaking that sometimes occurs when things get really intense in a classroom. Try not to panic, try not to raise your voice and yell, try to remain calm, and then as you think through your plan of action, begin to implement it. Again, always thinking of the safety of other students in the room around you. And what you should have in place is if you have a dangerous student, you should have an emergency exit plan where perhaps you keep a red circle. This is what I did. I kept a red circle tag by the door, and I had 2 or 3 safe students that knew the procedure. If I said red, go, then that student, whoever I was addressing at that time, whoever was in the room and knew that it was their time to handle that, I'd say, red, go, Mary. And that person would stand up and immediately take the red tag to the office, going as quickly as they could without running. And that signaled the administrators who knew the plan to come to the room to begin to provide an intervention. Additionally, if I needed to remove the other students from the room, we had rehearsed an exit plan, not with that student named, but for if any student required a red go, then every student in the room knew that didn't matter who it was, this was the plan. You get up, you walk quietly out of the room, and then the teacher will handle the red go. Worked, used it. It was unfortunate, but there were times when that was necessary. So, again, the length of these particular videos, I think they're I think it's a lot, but I also, again, have heard expressed from each of you how classroom management is a challenge, or you feel like you're competent at it, but in your journal entries you're saying, I don't know, there's some things happening, and I'm not really sure why I can't get kids to do what I want. So I don't mind these videos being longer. I do apologize for not sticking to my 10-minute length, 10 or 11 minutes. But I also know that the research shows that an effective classroom manager is vital to being able to implement instruction. You can't have one without the other. Quality instruction and classroom management, they need to work in tandem. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. I apologize for my 7-year-old coming in and my cat, but I think that the example that the 7-year-old provided was probably pretty effective for this particular video. Thank you.